You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hello, my name is Mike Fraga, and I'm your guide to a course that seeks to understand some of the issues that concern the contemporary United States immigrant population in general, and the Mexican and Central American immigrant population in specific. The world's nations have their populations existing as American citizens in the United States today, and their respective histories intermingle in the streets of all the major cities of the United States. In this course, we have reached the stage where we are exploring the different racial and continental expressions emanating from the American immigrant experience. There are all the peoples of the world here in Los Angeles: the European, the Russian, the African, the Asian, the Indian, the Pacific Islanders, Middle Easterners, and the native peoples of the Western Hemisphere. We are all part of a place that the Spanish called Nuestra Señora cerca del Río Porciúncula, Reina Los Angeles. So for those of you who just tuned in on cable television, there is an 800 number that's available for you, and by all means, please call in if you have any questions or comments about the topics that will be covered today. We are going to cover the African immigrant experience. And students, please take advantage of the online address and chat with me as we explore the themes for the course. And please, by all means, students, call in if you can. I'd like to hear your voice. I'd like to hear the questions that you have or the comments that you might have with regards to the material that's going to be covered. So the immigration issues are very dear to this administration that we have this year. So let's take a look at what's happening and what happened this past week.
A group of 6 young undocumented immigrants sued the Trump administration Monday in a San Francisco federal court, challenging the president's decision to end DACA. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which gives nearly 800,000 undocumented immigrants permission to live and work in the United States. The suit argues the Trump administration failed to follow proper administrative procedures in rescinding DACA and that revoking the program violates due process laws. We'll have more on that later in the broadcast. The lawsuit was filed as undocumented activists and their allies shouted down Democratic House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi during a San Francisco news conference, accusing her of using Dreamers as bargaining chips in a meeting with President Trump last week, in which she sought to win legislation protecting young immigrants in exchange for a more militarized U.S.-Mexico border. The protesters demanded protections not only for Dreamers, but for all 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States. After headlines, we'll speak with Congressman Luis Gutierrez and a DACA recipient suing President Trump. And in New York City, 3 Democratic members of Congress were among 10 activists arrested at a nonviolent civil disobedience action outside Trump Tower Tuesday as they protested President Trump's plan to rescind DACA, an immigration program that shields 800,000 young immigrants from deportation. Among those arrested, Congress members Luis Gutierrez of Illinois and Raul Grijalva of Arizona.
To Donald Trump's residence here in New York City, and we're going to denounce the end of DACA, and we're going to demand justice for our immigrant community and for him to end his white supremacist, xenophobic attacks against our community.
Because you have to make the point. The point is that we need a Clean Dream Act, and we need it to be done immediately, and there's urgency to it.
Right, we are here united. We are not going to stand for bigoted policies that rip our families apart. That is not what this nation is about, and that is not what this nation supports.
That last voice was Melissa Mark Viverito, Speaker of the New York City Council, who was arrested as well, along with Congressman Adriano Espaillat of New York during the nonviolent civil disobedience action outside Trump Tower. To see Democracy Now!'s full report on Tuesday's protest in support of DACA and undocumented Dreamers, to see our full interview with Luis Gutierrez in our studio, visit democracynow.org. California has sued President Trump over the construction of his proposed border wall, saying the administration's not complying with state and federal environmental laws. This is California Attorney General Xavier Becerra.
The border between the U.S. and Mexico spans some 2,000 miles. The list of laws violated by the president's administration in order to build his campaign wall is almost as long. The Department of Homeland Security would waive 37 federal statutes, as well as regulations that are related to those statutes, and he would also violate numerous state and local laws here in our great state of California.
In Washington, D.C., 3 children of Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II have asked the U.S. Supreme Court to reject the Trump administration's ban on refugees and travelers from 6 majority Muslim nations. Karen Korematsu, Hali Yasui, and Jay Hirabayashi filed an amicus brief Monday arguing the travel ban violates the Constitution. In 1944, their fathers were litigants in Korematsu versus the United States, an unsuccessful Supreme Court challenge to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's mass incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans.
Trump's election represents the Republicans' commitment to white racial power. It started with Nixon's Southern strategy. It gained fruition with Reaganomics and Papa Bush's 1,000 points of light, and permanently ensconced itself in the guise of son of a Bush's terrorism doctrine. This commitment to white racial power is what got Trump elected. When looking at the recent demonstrations of this white superiority fantasy, the people participating are not the common poor white trash stereotypes of thugs with tattoos, though some of them are posing as militant buffoons, but middle-class professionals working in offices and in higher education and living as your next-door neighbors. When Barack Obama was elected, the reactionaries began recruiting heavily under the Tea Party label. Now under Trump, they have blatantly come out coveting white power, white privilege. The religious right, meanwhile, underscores white supremacy. Evangelicals and fundamentalists give praise to God for bringing Trump to power. There's a long history of racism and anti-Semitism in the United States. Today, the alt-right is well armed with automatic rifles. This is what the Republicans let loose from their closet when they gave Trump the executive suite. It will be interesting to see how they try to control this idiot that they granted power to. So in this course, what we're up to today, when we came to appreciate last week the richness of the European immigrant tradition. This is an experience that is rooted in labor organizing and socialist development. We appreciated white beans. Now let's taste the black beans. Today we will look specifically at the African experience. After understanding the European experience with voluntary immigration last week, we will juxtapose Europe with Africa so as to appreciate the involuntary immigrant experience. So in this session, we will come to appreciate how involuntary immigrants influence the development of the United States, especially in the areas of civil and political rights. What we have learned so far from the European is that when you are in a disadvantaged position, you must organize for your rights. We will see that this is also true for all immigrants, especially involuntary immigrants, the black beans. So, let's talk about white versus black labor forces in the British colonies in the area that became known as the American South. Now, there is a problem with regards to the South in general and the Chesapeake in particular that historians have difficulty confronting. Why did the transformation from a free labor system to a slave labor system occur? And that seems to be the question. Now, most colonial historians argue that it was essentially economics. Slaves were less expensive than indentured servants and more profitable. They were better agriculturalists than those coming from England, and they could withstand semi-tropical weather and the accompanying diseases while working in excruciating conditions. So let's look at how slaves were valued as labor forces for the production of goods and services in the southern United States.
Slavery first appeared on American plantations very early in colonial times. Jamestown, Virginia, America's first English colonial settlement, was founded in 1607. Just 12 years later, the first Africans were sold here to work on tobacco plantations. As the smoking habit spread, tobacco became the most valuable export of the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. As that happened, the number of tobacco plantations increased and more slaves were imported, so that by 1750, about 200,000 black slaves were living in the English colonies of America. In the colonies of South Carolina and Georgia, most slaves were forced to work in huge flooded fields like this one, where rice was raised, or on plantations where indigo plants were cultivated, from which a valuable blue dye was made. In colonial times, the lands along the northern coast of the Gulf of Mexico, from Texas to Florida, were ruled by Spain or France. In this area, the majority of slaves worked on large sugarcane plantations, similar to those in the West Indies. Cotton, the plant most people associate with slavery, did not become an important crop until well after American independence.
Okay, so again, the first question was, why did the transformation from a free labor system to a slave labor system occur? And most importantly, with regards to the slave labor system, why did it become racially defined? So historians debate and consider whether racial prejudice preceded the introduction of slaves or whether it developed after bondage. Many writing generalized textbooks for U.S. history classes essentially take the position that race itself was largely coincidental, that economics was more important. After all, by the time that the British entered the slave trade, the Spanish, Dutch, and the Portuguese were already involved. So the easy answer becomes that racism developed afterwards. Moreover, the argument continues that blacks were preferred because as runaways, they were more easily definable. Slavery was not introduced at the beginning of colonization or the creation of colonies. There were black and white servants, but colonizers, historians argue, had no idea of slavery. It was after 1650 that the emphasis on color evolved, so a distinction was needed between servitude and slavery so as to encourage settlement. Whereas whites voluntarily came, blacks were forced to come. To add to this debate, racism was imposed from above late in the 17th century as a response to a white indentured rebellion in 1670 that became known as Bacon's Rebellion. Now, racism did not bring about slavery, but rather the master class was worried about the white masses uprising. Slaves conveniently replaced the threat of white masses rebelling. So that's the explanation that historians provide. That's the explanation that is the debate in the early colonial history. But there is an alternative explanation. When we take a look at European culture, and European culture itself, the existence of prejudice is already in the culture. Europe in general and the British in specific had a background of racism prior to colonial expansion. So in essence, really the answer is that both factors, economics and racism, were operating. So let's take a look at the concept of blackness in the European mind. This is the key to helping us appreciate something about racism. Now, in Europe, skin color was associated with values, physical values, cultural values, intellectual values. And so for the British, they were extremely conscious of skin color. The first contact England will have with Africans will be in the 1550s, and they will immediately make reference to the Africans' skin color and their lack of clothing. So with this suddenness of contact, England, which was scarcely aware that Africa existed, created exaggerated perceptions of blackness and self. And so when we take a look at the concept of blackness in the European mind, blackness is loaded with meaning in European cultures. I don't care if it's Spanish, if it's Italian, if it's German, if it's Dutch, any culture coming out of Europe. Blackness is loaded with meaning in the culture because black conveys the worst fears, especially of the world. Black means to be deeply stained with dirt. Black means to be soiled. Black related to death. Black related to being sinister, to being wicked. Black is not a neutral color in European circles. White, on the other hand, equals purity. White, on the other hand, equals virtue, virginity, innocence. Why don't women wear black when they get married? Okay, so today they wear tan or off-white. But black is loaded with negativity. To the British, racial differences were deeply disturbing. Racial differences in color posed and still poses an intellectual problem. So theories were developed to help understand race. And first was the environmental theory. The British figured that the sun and its heat and its exposure to the sun produced the darker skin. So it was logical to understand why Native peoples, Africans, and Asians had darker skin to Europeans. But problems with this theory developed because the Africans, the Asians, and the Native peoples of the Western Hemisphere who were taken to live in England didn't lose their skin color. So a religious theory was developed. England looked to the Bible for justification of slavery and blackness. And you have many, many fundamentalist preachers still adhering to this particular theory, the religious theory. It was God's treatment of Ham. God's treatment of Ham and his son perhaps provided the clue as to why Africans were, quote unquote, the servant of servants. Ham was cursed to being a servant. So the British applied this curse to the African and associated the curse with blackness. But a problem developed. There is nothing in the Bible relating to skin color. Basically, the English had an attitude towards the color black that leads scholars to understand why they read blackness into the curse. But blackness was also associated with other negative images. Blackness was related to being subhuman. Blackness was related to having animal-like qualities. When the British viewed African cultural expressions, they immediately wrote negatively on the non-Christian quality of African religion. To them, this was a sign of a lack of civility, but was really abhorrent to the European pious Christian tradition were the polysemous expressions that were invoked during African religious rituals. These body movements, and then of course the minimal clothing, indicated to the European that Africans had loose sexuality. So with no sufficient dress, with nakedness, and with severe body movements, Africans were seen as sexual and lustful. And this sex and this lustfulness was tied to animal-like movements. And they related Africans to the images of apes. Apes became known to the English as the same time as Africans, hence the link. Now we have all become familiar with the story of Tarzan, but what we must come to terms with is the image of King Kong. This is the racist image that keeps reappearing every generation so as to send a subliminal message. The original King Kong movie appeared at a time of heightened racial tension as African Americans began moving out of the South and into northern cities. The fear of the black man, especially the black man with a white woman, has perplexed American society. Hence the King Kong image, the fear of this beast devouring an innocent white virgin, especially a white woman. This combination of negative perceptions was in the culture prior to the English turning to slavery as the solution to the formation and control of labor forces in the Chesapeake region. So what happened to Africans before slavery officially began in Virginia? What happened to Africans before slavery officially began in the Chesapeake? Well, 1619 is the first year that Africans appear in Virginia. And the evidence suggests that Africans were treated worse than white indentured servants prior to slavery. By 1640, the evidence indicates that slavery entered Virginia. Because in Virginia, in 1640, there are some free Africans and some enslaved ones. However, there are no enslaved whites. Now, there is a case in 1640 in Virginia of 3 runaway servants. 2 were whites, and 1 was African. The white servitude was extended for 3 years. while the Africans was extended for life. And by 1650, the first slave laws are going to be introduced. There were more black women than white women working the fields. And why? Because African women were preferred because of their agricultural expertise. And it was common in the Chesapeake to tax all male workers as part of revenue raising. The tax law was extended to all African female workers. And the law also set up a requirement forbidding the enlistment of Africans to colonial militias. Colonial administrators did not like the idea of a black man with a gun. And this is part of the fear of Africans in the English cultural tradition. So let's take a look at a film clip from the History Channel that addresses the origins of slavery.
In 1619, Virginia was an isolated British settlement on the Chesapeake Bay, sparsely populated by men trying to make the colony profitable for England. But the colonists were devastated by hunger, disease, and raids by Native Americans. So when the White Lion, a badly damaged Dutch slave ship, arrived carrying 20 kidnapped Africans, the colonists bartered food and services for the human cargo. The colonists had no model for slavery. The Africans joined poor white Europeans as indentured servants. They would earn land and freedom in exchange for 7 years of hard labor. The colonies prospered, and as exports grew more profitable, the colonists were reluctant to lose their labor. Unlike their European counterparts who held citizenship in their home countries, Africans were not subject to English common law. They were workers without rights. In 1641, slavery was legalized. Africans became chattel, personal property that could be owned for life. Slave labor enabled the colonies to become so profitable that in 1660, England's King Charles II established the Royal African Company to transport humans they called black gold from Africa to the Americas. When England finally outlawed its slave trade in 1807, America relied on its own internal slave trade. By 1860, 1 million humans were being moved and sold in the colonies. Families were torn apart. Traders marched their chattel from the East Coast to the southern plantations. Along the way, slaves were herded like animals into crowded pens, yards, and warehouses. Traders and owners wanted a self-reproducing labor force, and the labels they used reflect the degradations of slavery. Bucks and breeding wenches were sold at auction, along with prime hands to work the fields and fancy girls, graceful, light-skinned women who were sold into prostitution or to be mistresses to their masters. The enslaved population was controlled by legally authorized violence, whippings and public floggings. Owners were fined if they did not punish recaptured runaway slaves. But slavery had always had its critics in America. As the slave trade grew, so did opposition. And eventually America became a country divided against itself.
Okay, so what's going to be important in this particular course is to understand the African dimension, because when we take a look at the African experience in the United States, the formation and control of labor forces, we can find many parallels to what's occurring today with the undocumented immigrant. And that is why it's so important to appreciate the black beans. So did racism precede slavery? Well, the scattered evidence confirms that it did. British cultural traditions reveal fear, bias, and abhorrence of things black. Historians do know that once slavery is written into law, racial prejudice explodes. So to emphasize that King Kong phenomenon, as early as the 17th century, laws are written in each colony forbidding racial mixture, especially for the protection of white women, since white men can have sex with whomever they want. So, how did Africans arrive in the Western Hemisphere? The captives embark on the infamous Middle Passage. It was so called because it was the middle leg of a three-part voyage, a voyage that began and ended in Europe. The first leg of the voyage carried a cargo and often included iron, cloth, brandy, firearms, and gunpowder. Upon landing on Africa's quote-unquote slave coast, the cargo was exchanged for Africans. And fully loaded with its human cargo, the ship set sail for the Americas, where the slaves were exchanged for sugar, tobacco, or some other product. And the final leg brought the ship back to Europe. Let's watch a film clip that helps us understand the Middle Passage.
The thing that distinguishes slavery in Africa from Atlantic slavery is race. Europeans set in motion a system of slavery that was predicated on the idea that certain people were marked as enslavable. We've learned a great deal about the Middle Passage in the last 40 years or so. The volume of the trade involved the removal of about 12.5 million people from the African continent. The Middle Passage was the middle leg of a voyage that starts in Europe. The first passage is from Europe to Africa. The Middle Passage is the journey from Africa to America. And then the third passage is the journey back from America to Europe.
The Middle Passage could take anywhere from 2 to 3 months. Men and women were separated. Men typically were held in the lower belly of the ship. The roof, if you would, was quite low, probably about 4 feet high, so people couldn't stand. African men were shackled together, and they were packed so closely together in a spoon-like position, and they would stay like that for pretty much the entire journey.
You're talking about hundreds of people. You're at 120 degrees. It smells terrible. There are actually people dying around you, which has to be a traumatic experience for everybody on board.
Maybe 10% of voyages, we know there was some attempt to rise up, to kill the crew, to try to turn the boat around, to change their destinies. Historians have a hard time capturing what the Middle Passage must have felt like for enslaved men and women. It's a voyage that is deeply disorienting. It's a voyage to a place that you can't anticipate. You don't know what's going to happen to you. I don't think we have adequate words to capture that experience.
I know this ain't home, but it's where you gotta be. It's time your family pay kunta.
Okay, as the film clip reveals, mortality rates were high in the Middle Passage. And although it's difficult to determine how many Africans died en route to this place called the New World, it's now believed that between 10 and 20% of those transported lost their lives. So this experience is important for us to remember because it is being repeated today by the tragedies that are imposed on those crossing the border from Mexico into the United States. The Middle Passage continues across the U.S.-Mexico border today. People are dying en route from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean as they journey to the United States. So let's talk about the American Revolution, and let's share the contradictory message with regards to slavery and race. So while the majority of Africans are enslaved, free blacks in the colonies faced increasing segregation despite being allowed to form their own communities. So it was obvious to many when we take a look at the American Revolution that not all men were created equal. So the abolitionist movement is important for us to remember. The abolitionist movement in U.S. history is important because it reveals a commitment to fight for civil rights. It reveals a commitment to fight for human rights, both black people and white people who are involved in abolitionism. Now, I'd like to concentrate on the abolitionist movement prior to and during the American Revolutionary War. There was both white and black opposition to slavery. Now, white opposition to slavery prior to the Revolution was few in number. One could say that prior to the revolt, the abolitionist movement was a Quaker movement. So the Quaker religion here is very important. During the Revolution and thereafter, between 1770 and 1790, many groups formed arguing for slavery's abolishment. And causes for the rise of white abolitionism can be traced to religion, and most importantly, the revivalist tradition of everyone being equal before the eyes of God. And that then can be traced to the revolutionary ideas themselves, the fight for liberty. So, the fight against political oppression. So the connection with black slavery becomes clear. The revolution should include the abolitionists, should include abolition. When we take a look at the South, when we take a look at the leaders of the American Revolution, the South is being hypocritical. Let's go to a film clip that helps us appreciate this dimension of the Quaker religion.
We often think about the abolition movement beginning in the 1830s with the really famous abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass. But really it goes all the way back to the colonial era. Of course, the first people to resist slavery are the enslaved Africans themselves. But in terms of white critics, the earliest ones are almost always Quakers. And it's really in the 1750s when the Quakers kind of really as a society, the Society of Friends, turn against slavery, and that's largely due to the actions of two men, John Woolman of New Jersey and Anthony Benezet of Pennsylvania. And between 1755, beginning then, the leaders of the Quakers begin to pass a series of resolutions saying the Quakers can no longer own slaves. And by 1776, most Quakers in America have accepted these rules and they've ended slavery within the society. Beginning with the American Revolution, this opens up a new opportunity for Quakers to move their anti-slavery beyond their own religious group to American society as a whole. And they begin petitioning the Confederation Congress in 1783. And they petition them pretty much nonstop.
Okay, so I agree with Professor Nicholas Wood, because I like to concentrate on the abolitionist movement prior to and during the American Revolutionary struggle, because most often everybody talks about the abolitionist movement in the 1830s. But really, the abolitionist movement begins during the Revolutionary period, and as Professor Wood was saying right before, again, the causes for the rise of white abolitionism can be traced to religion and the revivalist tradition of everyone being equal before the eyes of God. Now, black opposition was continuous throughout slavery. So the black spirituals, when you take a look at the black spirituals, they are based on the yearning for freedom, on the search for justice. In the North, opposition is going to take formal political steps using the language of the Revolution. Free blacks are going to petition state legislatures to abolish slavery. So black opposition also consisted of participation in the military on both sides of the conflict. And the British Army made the most extensive efforts to raise troops in the colonies. And the most radical appeal was Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which offered freedom to blacks if they joined the British Army. However, Britain did not grant freedom to all. They were unequally treated in the military and they were forced to do manual labor. So when England lost to the United States, some ended up in Nova Scotia, creating a free black community. Others journeyed to West Africa and created a British colony called Sierra Leone. Now, the American Army itself resisted black enlistment at first, but as the war dragged on, the North recruited heavily, the Upper South some, and the Lower South not at all. In all, about the same number of blacks enlisted on both sides of the conflict, and sometimes slave owners sent their slaves to fight in their place. However, blacks were relegated to the worst duties. Some did arm bears, bear arms. For the majority, the military was an avenue to freedom and an opportunity to travel. Now, back on the plantation, slaves took advantage of increased opportunities during the war for rebellion against and escape from the master, particularly in the Lower South, where the Lower South became the front in the latter half of the war. Slaves entertained guerrilla warfare and economic disruptions. And when the war front moved to the south, many whites left the plantations. About 1/3 of the white population left South Carolina. And throughout the war, there were scattered instances of rebellion, insolence, stealing, rumors of slave plots, insurrection. So many times the militia in the South policed slaves from the fear of insurrection. And the largest rebellion became known as Gabriel's Plot in Virginia on August 30th, 1800. Slaves planned a march on the city of Richmond demanding the abolition of slavery. And right after the Revolution in the fall of 1800, Virginia militiamen broke up an underground army of about 600 slaves and some free black workers that were poised to march on the capital city of Richmond. The leader of the revolt was a young blacksmith named Gabriel Prosser. He was a slave who could read and write. Now, he was aware himself of a slave rebellion in Haiti and Santo Domingo, where Africans liberated themselves against French rule. He planned a slave revolt to spark a more general uprising. So Gabriel challenged Virginia to end slavery and to uphold equal rights for every man. But unfortunately for him, the plot was uncovered. And Gabriel and 25 accused of leading the plot are going to be ceremoniously hung in public as a lesson to all slaves. Gabriel and 25 of his followers went to the gallows for daring to claim freedom. So again, let's take a look at this particular experience of Gabriel, because it kind of we can find parallels with regards to the children of immigrants today, the deferred action for childhood arrivals. Let's go to Gabriel's Plot.
After the invention of the cotton gin, the threat of sale loomed larger than ever before, and laws were passed to keep slaves under a tighter watch. Some resisted by running away, others by stealing or refusing to work. A very few saw no other alternative but to take up arms. One was a slave named Gabriel, who stole a pig and was hauled into a courthouse outside Richmond, Virginia in 1799.
Gabriel was caught stealing a pig. Instead of accepting the abuse, which of course every slave was supposed to accept, he threw the man to the ground, wrestled him to the ground, and bit off the better part of his left ear. That, of course, was a capital crime. Pig stealing was a common occurrence. Biting white people was something that it was not encouraged for black Virginians to do.
Gabriel was convicted of attacking and maiming the white man who caught him. To deter others from such crimes, he was publicly humiliated, branded, and forced to spend a month in jail. As Gabriel sat in his cell, he decided that the time was right to organize the slaves of Richmond and strike against those who were holding them in bondage.
The only time that slaves would have had any mobility without the most rigid observation of whites would have been on a Sunday, would have been at night. Religious gatherings could have, in some cases, provided an opportunity for people to meet. We must never forget that any kind of move toward liberation among blacks was a question of life and death.
Like all revolutionaries, Gabriel seemed to have very little concern for violence and danger. He was 6'2", 6'3", in a time of relatively shorter men. He was a blacksmith, so he was a man of enormous strength. He was described as having scars on his face. He was missing most of his front teeth, and I suspect that came from mixing it up in the quarters with other slaves. He was a man who people instinctively tended to follow, and he apparently feared very little.
After his release, Gabriel began hammering out instruments of war, turning shovels into swords and molding bullets. Through most of the year 1800, he recruited soldiers for a rebel army.
All the whites were to be massacred, except the Quakers, the Methodists, and the Frenchmen, and they were to be spared on account of their being friendly to liberty. They intended also to spare all the poor white women who had no slaves. Ben Woolfolk, conspirator.
Obviously, he was not a naive man. He realized that this would be black freedom born of white fear, not out of white magnanimity.
1,000 men was to be raised from Richmond, 600 from Ground Squirrel Bridge, and 400 from Goochland. The business of the insurrection had so far advanced that we were compelled, even if discovered, to go forward. Solomon, conspirator.
Gabriel decided his troops would move at midnight on August 30th, 1800, carrying a flag with the motto, "Death or Liberty."
We can imagine what it was like on that day in August in 1800, with scores of African Americans gathering on a Sunday to create this rebellion with picks and axe and knives and clubs, and what it must have been like for them, prepared to strike and yet unable to strike.
That very evening, one observer wrote, there came on the most terrible thunderstorm accompanied with an enormous rain. Rivers swelled, roads and bridges washed away, and when it became clear that the business, as it was called, would be impossible in the storm, Gabriel tried to postpone the revolt, but before morning, the plot was betrayed by 2 slaves.
What's phenomenal is how close it got. If the accounts and the inferences we can make about the numbers, that it lasted so long before any betrayal is quite extraordinary.
Gabriel went to trial on October 6th, 1800. He refused to testify or to explain his actions, but one of the rebels did make a statement.
I have nothing more to say in my defense than what General Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British and put to trial. I have adventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, and I am a willing sacrifice in their cause. And I beg, as a favor, that I may be immediately led to execution. I know that you have predetermined to shed my blood. Why then, all this mockery of a trial?
Okay, so the rise of abolitionism was caused by white people who cared to extend the fight for liberty to slavery. The rise of abolitionism was caused by black people who did their best to challenge the slave system and the circumstances of the period. People were responding to the practicalities of the revolution. So what were the achievements of this movement prior to and during the revolution? Well, legal steps to limit slavery were implemented. At the national level, the international slave trade was to end in 1808. The South agreed to this provision in the Constitution simply because they thought slavery would die out eventually, since the plantation economy after the Revolutionary War was in a doldrum. And at the regional level, slavery was prohibited from entering the area designated as the Northwest Territory. And at the state level, free laws were passed in many state governments, and slavery was abolished in every state north of Delaware. And those who owned slaves in the northern states had until 1820 to emancipate their charges. All states north of Delaware encouraged gradual emancipation in 1820. And in the South, laws were passed to free slaves on an individual basis. So when we take a look at the involuntary immigrants' civil rights contribution, it is abolitionism. The impact of the abolitionist movement cannot be underestimated. It is good to know that at least some people dared to stand up and create change. And when one looks at the percentages of free black populations between 1760 and 1810, we can understand the depth of this liberation movement. In 1760, less than 1% of the black population in the British colonies was free. By 1810, estimates range that from 15 to 20% of the black population is liberated in the new United States. So by 1810, there were approximately 100,000 liberated Africans in the North and an equal number in the South. Now, liberated Africans, or what they call as free blacks, they have a large impact on slave society. Students, think about why a free black would have an impact on slave society. Just as much as immigrants today, once they become citizens, will have an impact on those who are not. Now, their labor and economic condition changed little because free blacks in the North were poorly paid artisans, while in the South they were tenant farmers, not even owning the land that they lived on. And in all places, free blacks are going to be discriminated against. They will experience the racialization process. However, as a free person, they provided hope to slaves. Liberated Africans experienced more cultural independence. Most importantly, they got to sing in public. Most importantly, they changed their names. Most importantly, they created their own religious institutions, their own cultural institutions. And as they faced increasing racial segregation in the North, they adapted institutions to fit their needs. They created mutual aid societies, their own schools, their own churches, and all of them had African names. This is how liberated Africans gave hope to those who were enslaved. In the 1790s, abolitionism declines and will not rear its head again until the 1830s. People were not as vocal in continuing the movement as before. Basically, Eli Whitney created the cotton gin, and with the cotton gin, the profitability of slavery increased, and thereby it ended any discussion of abolition in the South. And in the North, there was an overriding desire amongst the white populations for national unity. There were also attitudinal differences amongst the whites. And just as long as slavery did not enter their states or neighborhoods, everything was fine. Meanwhile, slaves continued to build on their experiences as they underwent cultural transformations, religious revivals, and family changes. Now, I wanted to bring up the abolitionist movement prior to and during the Revolutionary War because most people think that the movement began during the era of reform under the Jacksonian democracy. But what actually happened was the abolitionist movement had quieted for 30 years, and then a groundswell of controversy was created as the United States expanded its borders from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean during the period 1830 to 1850. In the decades before the Civil War, many Northerners struggled to bring an end to slavery by any means possible. So we're going to watch a film clip from the abolitionist movement right prior to the Civil War. This was an important movement that was led by different peoples, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, John Brown. But we'll take a look at Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and John Brown later. Let's take a look at William Lloyd Garrison.
In the late 1820s, there were 2 million men, women, and children living in bondage in the United States. In the 50 years since the Revolution, every northern state had outlawed slavery. It had once seemed likely that it would disappear in the South as well, but no more. The invention of the cotton gin had led to a massive increase in cotton production, making slavery indispensable to both the South and the North.
It's actually quite astounding how deeply entrenched it was in the nation's political and economic life. What is seen as this sort of idiosyncratic, peculiar Southern institution actually had an enormous economic significance in the national economy of the United States.
slaves were the single largest financial asset in the entire American economy, worth more than all manufacturing, all railroad, steamship lines, and other transportation systems put together. The only thing in the American economy worth more as simply a financial asset was the land itself, and no one really quite knows how to value North America.
The only voices advocating the abolition of slavery were black. Their frustration was growing, and some of them were becoming more militant. But no one in power was listening. As of yet, no white Americans could imagine turning millions of dollars worth of slaves into millions of black compatriots. But scattered around the country, a few lonely souls were convinced that slavery was a crime against God and man. And in Boston, one of them was coming to understand that God intended he do something about it. William Lloyd Garrison felt that he was destined to do great things, but he had no idea how to get there. In 1828, he was 22 years old, newly arrived in the city from his hometown of Newburyport. Garrison's father, a seaman and a drunk, had abandoned the family when Garrison was 2 years old. Plunged into poverty, Garrison's mother left her children for years on end as she looked for work. But in their time together, she managed to drum a fierce Christian conscience into her son.
William Lloyd Garrison's religious background was not just a background. It was at the core of who he was. It was an indwelling spirit inside of him that constantly thought about making God's will come into being on this earth.
Shortly after arriving in Boston, Garrison happened to meet an itinerant publisher who was raising money for his one-man anti-slavery newspaper. Garrison was horrified by descriptions of the slave pens, where men, women, and children were held awaiting shipment further south. And he began to think that ending slavery was the cause that could give meaning to his life.
Okay, that was William Lloyd Garrison, but that was the abolitionist movement that sprung up in the 1830s and was very significant all the way through to the Civil War. Now, the controversy over slavery that plagued the United States since the inception of this country began with what is known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. And as written in the Constitution, there was an obligation of free states to return runaway slaves back to the owners. And likewise, Congress decided to abolish the slave trade in 1808. And slavery was also to be excluded in the Northwest Territory in 1787. And there was gradual emancipation in every state north of Delaware, north of the famous Mason-Dixon line. Yet there is no reference in the Constitution to slavery except with regards to taxation and population. So when we take a look at Article 1, Section 2, Number 3 of the Constitution, it states that representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included in the Union according to their numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. This 3/5 clause is important to understand, because how did Congress come to determine that slaves were 3/5 a human being? Well, first of all, slaves were not an influential function in the economy of the North, and there was a question of climate as a causal factor in determining the use of slavery and the creation of a plantation economy. The North produces the same foodstuffs as Europe. However, there is a worldwide demand for tropical goods and foodstuffs. The worldwide plantation economy was in tropical and semi-tropical zones, and the South is in a semi-tropical zone, while the North is in a temperate zone. The North included many people in a semi-subsistence economy, hence the creation of a more diversified economy. There was a multiplier effect that was built into it due to the demand for artisan goods with agricultural products. But the South, because of the plantation economy, created no urban markets for agricultural products or artisan goods. So why was Congress able to compromise in 1787 with regards to slaves, taxation, and population? So when the new government was being established, debates occurred between the slaveholding states and the non-slaveholding states over representation and taxation. See, Congress prior to 1787 contained only one house. It was a unicameral legislation. So both small and big states, with regards to their populations, wanted to ensure themselves an adequate voice in the national government. Now, slavery at that time played an influential role in the economy of the South, while in the North, slavery was not important. Now, most of the states north of Delaware legislated gradual emancipation in 1787, with slavery to end by 1820. And since in the North, economic activity was geared to the re-export and shipbuilding economy, and since most of the population was semi-subsisting, the need for slavery was minimal. However, the worldwide demand for tropical goods and foodstuffs, for instance, sugar, rice, tobacco, encouraged the South to rely on an economy of scale based on slave labor. So when representatives from the states met to devise a plan for the national government, the following issues led to the Three-Fifths Compromise. With regards to representation based on population, should the slave states be allowed to include their slaves as part of the population count? Now, the southern states voted yes. They wanted the slaves to be included in the population count so that they could have more votes in Congress, or more voice in Congress. The northern states voted no, not wanting the South to have so much influence. And then with regards to taxation based on population, should the slaves be counted? The northern states voted yes, wanting the South to count its slaves so as to ensure that they paid their fair share of the taxes. The southern states voted no, not wanting to increase their expenses for their recruited labor forces. So there was a deadlock in the decision-making process because the 13 states represented the new nation. Well, one was absent, and that was Rhode Island. Rhode Island vehemently opposed any compromise and struggled to become part of the system because it did not send representatives to the assembly. So Congress was in a deadlock, and they had to break the deadlock. And so there was this one man, Edmund Randolph from Virginia, who broke the deadlock by introducing the idea of two houses of Congress, not one. He introduced the concept of a bicameral legislature, one based on representation, which is the House of Representatives, and one representing each state, which is today the Senate. Now, the idea of the Senate relieved the small states and enabled the slave debate to come to a compromise. And so the formula put forward was based on a faulty economic model. It took 5 slaves to do the work of 3 white laborers, and that was the argument. So it was reasoned 3 out of every 5 slaves could be counted for taxation and representation. So slaves became 3/5 a human being. Now, why did the South favor this compromise? Well, first, there was a common cause to unite, nationalism. And second, the economic viability of slavery was not very bright. There were no major export sectors in the South. The plantation economy had been destroyed by the British during their march through the South, and Southern leaders thought slavery as an institution would eventually vanish. And third, there was already a widespread movement to end slavery in the North. But yet, despite the non-economic viability of slavery, the South needed to protect its investment in slavery, hence the compromise. So, let's understand something about compromise. See, before the Civil War, the government is going to keep peace amongst the white population by finding and offering available land. As we talked about the red beans. As long as the red beans are being removed, then the white population and the labor forces, they can find their way to land. So land is the key. So you keep peace amongst the white population by finding and offering available land. And in order to do this, the government had to displace and wage war against the native peoples and then the Mexicans. So in the process, they had to negotiate compromises to northern factions and to southern factions who envisioned different versions of the American dream. And the American dream was based on Jefferson's yeoman ideal, or the free family farm, or the free farm. The other version of the dream was based on the plantation economy, on plantation slavery. So it started out with the Three-Fifths Compromise. It continued with what is known as the Missouri Compromise, and with the occupation of Mexico, the California Compromise. So it was an ingenious balancing of interests. So with regards to the expansion of slavery, the United States had to compromise as new lands were incorporated into its domain. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise was entered into, and in 1850, the California Compromise was negotiated. So by 1820, when you take a look at this particular map, you can understand that the westward expansion of the U.S. to the Mississippi continued without heated controversies over slavery. Just take a look at this map very carefully, students, and you can understand that sectional rivalries were not serious sources of conflict, since the annexing of a free state usually was followed by a slave state. However, the South's political power was derived from the Three-Fifths provision of the Constitution, which became emphasized in the Senate, and this political domination was resented by Northeastern elements. So if you take a look at this map, you'll be able to see the movement west. There was an enormous proliferation of land and slaves as the plantation economy moved from the Old South in this region over west. And then, of course, the free family farm is moving into this region here, okay? So there was an enormous proliferation of land and slaves as the plantation economy moved from the Old South to the Mississippi. And the plantation economy experienced a cotton boom. And when you take a look at the cotton boom, this Mississippi region here was lucrative. Its rapid expansion alarmed the North. The North likewise expanded, and because of a larger population, had more representation in the House. So a race occurred for control of the Senate. And so a heated controversy developed over admitting Missouri as a slave state. Northeasterners are going to use Missouri as a means of blocking the South's political influence. So if you take a look at this map again, when you take a look at this map, let's see if I can clear it. Oh, well, I can't. I don't know how to clear it. Okay, I'm coming into problems here. But with regards to clearing it, I know I'm supposed to do something. Maybe, crew, you can tell me what I'm supposed to do. Okay, all the arrows. Anyway, when we take a look at this particular state right here, the South, Missouri. Missouri is going to be coming in. The Northeasterners are going to use Missouri as a means of blocking the South's political influence in the Senate. And so the South reacted as this is an attack on their slave labor system. If you admitted Missouri as a free state, then the balance between slave and free states would be upset. So a compromise was reached due to a concurrent movement to make the eastern part of Massachusetts a separate state, the state of Maine. So Maine is going to be admitted as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. The compromise was that slavery would be excluded from territories north of what is known as 3630, which is the southern border of Missouri. The attitudes emanating from the War of 1812 helped in creating the compromise, nationalism, and the concept of a national economic system. Everyone's interest would be satisfied by creating a common nationalism based on economic development. So let's go to a film clip from the History Channel that helps us appreciate the Missouri Compromise.
To understand what the Missouri Compromise is and why it's so significant in American history, we have to take it back about 200 years. Now, let me set the stage for you. The year is 1820. The U.S. is a young nation with 22 states, 11 free states in the north and 11 slave states in the south. But this balance is called into question when Missouri, a piece of land acquired from the Louisiana Purchase, wanted to be admitted into the Union as a slave state. Slavery was a highly contentious issue in the U.S. at this point. Some were pushing for the total abolition of slavery, while others looked to expand it. This issue pinned families and states against each other, creating a powder keg just waiting to explode. With tensions already high, the idea of Missouri entering as a slave state prompted heated debate in Congress, and throughout the nation too. Not just about Missouri, of course, but also how slavery factored into all future states and the future of the nation. Many argued over whether Congress even had the right to spread or limit slavery in the United States at all. While Northerners argued Congress should be allowed to prohibit slavery, Southerners insisted on popular sovereignty, the idea that it should be up to the states to determine this for themselves. These sentiments sound familiar? The biggest sticking point of the debate was political power. You see, Missouri's entrance as a slave state would throw off the balance of power in Congress. So to keep things even, Congress hashed out a separate solution, a compromise of sorts. In exchange for Missouri's admission as a slave state, the Northern Territory of Maine would be admitted as a free state. This ensured equal representation between the North and the South. A second part of the compromise banned slavery throughout the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory north of latitude line 3630. But while the Missouri Compromise limited the spread of slavery, it did nothing to abolish slavery in states that already had it. So while in some ways it staved off a civil war, it was only because it just maintained the status quo. The admission of Missouri as a slave state only fanned the flames of the national debate over slavery, a fierce disagreement that wouldn't be resolved until the end of the Civil War.
Okay, so that's just Missouri, and that was from the Louisiana Purchase territory. Now, what's going to happen when the United States takes over half of Mexico? So when the United States took over and began to occupy Mexico, the question of slavery's extension into the Mexican territory created heated debates over, quote unquote, the necessary evil that was known as, quote unquote, the peculiar institution. The California Compromise would be the last time that the United States would remain united under a compromise. Now, as in any marriage, when you compromise, and compromise, and compromise, you will eventually end up in a civil war, if not in civil court. The California Compromise of 1850 set off a chain of events that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Let's go to the California Compromise.
Historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about the Compromise of 1850. In 1850, things are way more complicated than before because it's the aftermath of the Mexican War with the acquisition of territory in the West in an era of great sectional strife. This is right after the gold rush in California of 1849, and there's an awful lot of pressure over what to do about admitting a state in the West that doesn't have a history of slavery and might alter the sectional balance between slave and free states in the U.S. Senate. And in January of 1850, a senator named Henry Clay, who's famous as a compromiser in American history, he offered a package of proposals to try to adjust the sectional debate between the country over this issue. And the debate in the Senate was fierce and intense, some of the most dramatic scenes in American history. And they turned over the architecture, the engineering of this compromise package to Stephen Douglas, a younger senator from Illinois, a Democrat. And Douglas decided that the only way to get enough support for all of the different elements of the compromise was to break it apart and treat it separately. When it achieved final form as a series of separate bills in the fall of 1860, there were only 5 bills. One was about the admission of California as a state, a free state. One was about the organization of the Southwest Territories, New Mexico and Utah, without regard to slavery. One was about the adjustment of the border with Texas and New Mexico. One was about the elimination of the slave trade in the District of Columbia. And the 5th and final bill, and most important for Southerners, a tougher federal fugitive slave law. Afterwards, enough people were relieved that they felt like they had achieved a kind of compromise, but most historians realize it was a shaky one at best. And even though it appeared for a couple of years that it would succeed, very quickly the fabric of the so-called Compromise of 1850 fell apart.
All right, and one of the most significant parts of that compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This was the first act to cause uproar over slavery, and this was the federal government's decision to become the enforcer of what previously had been state laws on runaway slaves, and what was already a part of the Constitution itself anyway when it came to the protection of property. Now remember, students, a slave is property. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 would ignite the flames of resistance against slavery. The act became a federal enforcement issue where people became obligated to arrest and seize anyone suspicious of being a runaway slave. The act deputized whoever suspected a black as a runaway and empowered the person to retrieve the suspect, who could be then taken to a southern state to be sold as a slave. All blacks became suspect to arbitrary arrest. And many free blacks were kidnapped, especially in Illinois. And they just made a famous movie about that. But the act obligated people to turn in suspects Otherwise, one could be fined. So when we take a look at today's law on undocumented immigrants, especially Arizona's SB 1070, it sounds dangerously similar to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Let's listen to Professor James Horton from George Washington University discuss the significance of the Slave Act of 1850.
Done jump the fence, going on down the line.
In January 1848, the discovery of gold in California's American River created what one newspaper called a revolution in the ordinary state of affairs. Many white Southerners saw the new territory as a last link in a great slave-holding republic that would stretch to the Pacific shore. Within a year, 80,000 pioneers made the trek to the Gold Coast. Many masters brought their slaves. By one estimate, African Americans sent home from California over $750,000 to buy loved ones out of bondage.
Done jump the fence, going on.
When Californians petitioned Congress to be a free state, Southern leaders threatened to quit the Union and form their own country. The price for saving the Union would be the rights of black people. In 1850, in return for a free California, Southern leaders in Congress demanded a tough new fugitive slave law. No black person, fugitive or freeborn, would be safe.
Under this law, a person, white or black, could be deputized on the spot to help in the recovery of a fugitive slave. So that if you were on the street and a marshal was chasing a fugitive, that marshal could deputize you and you would have to participate in the recapture of that fugitive under penalty of imprisonment and fine.
Special commissioners were appointed to try suspected runaways. Those accused were denied a trial by jury and the right to testify. Commissioners received $10 for every person returned to slavery, only $5 if the man or woman was acquitted.
It now made the federal government and northern citizens complicitous in the process of retrieving and retaining slaves back to their masters. It is the first time really in the lives of many white Northerners that the slavery issue, the slavery problem kind of comes home to their neighborhoods, it comes home to their communities. It means now to harbor a fugitive slave or even to be aware of a fugitive slave is to be committing a felony.
In New York, Harriet Jacobs was trying to make a new life when her former master's daughter, armed with the new law, came north to kidnap her.
It was the beginning of a reign of terror to the colored population. Many families who had lived in the city for 20 years fled from it now. Many a wife discovered a secret she had never known before, that her husband was a fugitive. Many a husband discovered that his wife had fled from slavery years ago, and the children of his love were liable to be seized and carried into slavery. I seldom ventured into the streets. I went as much as possible through back streets and byways. All that winter I lived in a state of anxiety.
I found my way to Boston. I got employment. I worked hard, but I didn't tell anybody I was a slave. One night, I heard someone running behind me. Almost before I could speak, I was lifted off my feet by 6 or 7 others, and it was of no use to resist. Anthony Burns.
All right, this particular experience is just amazing. It's given us many parallels to what's happening today, especially if we came to appreciate the black beans, because the black beans have gone through this before. Now, we can compare this experience. We find many parallels to the contemporary drama that's unfolding regarding the Dreamers and DACA. Now, let's talk about some people who are very important for us to remember, because these people are going to put their lives on the line for something larger than themselves. Let's start with Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass was the son of a black woman and an unknown white man. And Frederick Douglass would become a leading spokesperson for the abolition of slavery and for racial equality. Now, as a runaway slave, he dedicated himself to education and abolition. And in 1845, Frederick Douglass would write his autobiography and become one of the most controversial figures in the United States. And on July 4th, 1852, Douglass will be invited to speak on the significance of the 4th of July to Africans in Rochester, New York. In the speech, he will vilify America for its hypocrisy concerning independence while slavery existed. So let's watch a brief film clip from the History Channel that helps us appreciate the significance of this man.
Frederick Douglass becomes a symbol of the liberation of slaves in the country. Frederick Douglass, born a slave, that somehow has the audacity and drive to run away from slavery and decides to become a leader against slavery. So not only does he have the mental capacity to see himself free, he has the audacity to say, I can speak for the slaves better than the abolitionists that speak on our behalf and don't understand our pain.
Frederick Douglass is important to America because, unlike most enslaved people in America, he actually makes it out of slavery, is able to tell his story, and is able to actually become an agent for change in the Black community, in America in general.
Frederick Douglass traveled the length and width and breadth of this country as a leading abolitionist that made the issue of slavery a paramount issue through his editing newspapers, through his ceaseless travels and lectures. He helped to make it a real movement that by the time Abe Lincoln is running against Douglass, it is a national discussion. It would not have happened if you didn't have a spokesperson that worked as tirelessly as Frederick Douglass did.
Douglass is someone who is known in this country. He travels to England. He's an international figure. So he's important because he can tell you about slavery, the institution of slavery, because he lived it, and he can speak about that time period. He can tell you about escaping to freedom, and he can tell you about the free world. He bridges gaps. He's a part of transformation of America at this pivotal moment. And it's someone who, as I said, who begins under the cover of slavery and then ends outside of it.
Okay, that's Frederick Douglass. Now, one of the most controversial Supreme Court decisions that added fuel to the fire over the issue of slavery was Chief Justice Taney's decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. It's commonly referred to as the Dred Scott decision. Now, this decision relates to the contemporary immigrant experience today because, will Americans recognize that undocumented immigrants are citizens of this nation? Now, Taney ruled that people of African descent imported into the United States and held as slaves, or their descendants, whether or not they were slaves, were not protected by the Constitution and could never be citizens of the United States. It also held that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. The court also ruled that because slaves were not citizens, they could not sue in court. And lastly, the court ruled that slaves, as chattel or private property, could not be taken away from their owners without due process. So let's watch a film clip on this famous decision.
In 1857, the Supreme Court was a decidedly partisan institution. Of the 9 Supreme Court justices, 7 were pro-slavery Democrats. 5 came from slaveholding families. Their desire to secure the rights of slaveholders would cause them to make the most infamous judicial decision in American history. The man who started it all was named Dred Scott.
Dred Scott was a slave born in Virginia. His master ultimately moves him to St. Louis, where he is sold a couple of times and ultimately ends up in the hands of a man named John Emerson. John Emerson is an Army surgeon. And when John Emerson is posted to various frontier forts, the first one is in what is today Rock Island, Illinois, he takes Dred Scott with him as his servant. Now, presumably, Dred Scott becomes free the moment he's taken to Rock Island, because Rock Island is in Illinois. It's called Fort Armstrong at the time. But Dred Scott remains a slave at Fort Armstrong. And then his master takes him to Fort Snelling, which is today St. Paul, Minnesota. Now that is area that was made free under the Missouri Compromise.
Several years later, Dred Scott returned to St. Louis with his master. But after Emerson died, Scott sued for his freedom on the grounds that since he had lived in free territory, he was no longer a slave. A jury of 12 white men in a St. Louis circuit court judged him legally free.
2 years later, the Missouri Supreme Court reverses this. They reverse precedents going back to the beginning of Missouri statehood. And they are very frank about it. They say times have changed.
When John Emerson's widow remarried, she transferred ownership of Dred Scott to her brother, John Sanford.
John Sanford lives in New York, but has business interests in St. Louis. And so now Dred Scott can sue in federal court alleging he is a citizen of Missouri, his owner is a citizen of New York. And that's how the case goes forward to the Supreme Court.
No suit pressed by a slave had ever come before the Supreme Court before. It raised important questions.
The lawyers representing John Sanford made the argument that no black person can sue in federal court because black people can't be citizens of the United States.
The majority opinion in Dred Scott was written by Chief Justice Roger Taney. Taney was a resolute foe of racial equality, the Republican Party, and the anti-slavery movement.
Chief Justice Taney begins by saying Dred Scott can't sue because blacks can't be citizens. And he makes a very famous statement. He says at the time of the Constitution, they had no rights, they meaning blacks, had no rights that the white people needed to respect. Now, having said that Dred Scott can't sue, the technical legal thing Taney should have done was said case dismissed. Because obviously if Dred Scott can't sue, then he can't be in court. Taney can't hear the case any longer.
But Chief Justice Taney didn't stop there.
Taney goes on to face another constitutional question of whether Congress could constitutionally have passed the Missouri Compromise. Did Congress have the power to prohibit slavery in the Western territories? And here he makes an argument based on the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says you cannot be deprived of your property without due process of law. And so he makes the argument that the federal territories cannot ban slavery because slavery is a fundamentally protected property within the United States constitutional scheme. He says, basically, look, the Constitution is pro-slavery. We have a pro-slavery country. Slavery is a protected property. It's protected more than any other kind of property. And it's protected in the territories. This was also, by the way, essentially a drop-dead letter to the New Republican Party, because the New Republican Party, organized in 1854 after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was based on the theory that you should stop slavery from spreading into the territories.
We fearlessly declare that there never was under the whole heaven a more atrocious, wholesale wickedness perpetrated upon the bench of justice than this.
Such a decision cannot stand. All that is merciful and just on earth and in heaven will execrate and despise this edict of Taney.
The nation has achieved a triumph. Sectionalism has been rebuked and abolitionism has been staggered and stunned.
Dred Scott himself was purchased by the sons of a former owner and set free a year later. But the controversy surrounding the Dred Scott decision did not quickly die down.
It's that third element in the triangle of disasters, I suppose, in the pre-Civil War decade. And that here now the court has joined the politicians in making a decision in this case in which the Supreme Court decides basically that Dred Scott and by extension all black Americans have no constitutional rights that whites are bound to respect.
Okay, so all of the controversies described previously were sparked by one of the most contentious civil rights movements of the era. And that movement came to be identified as the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was an informal network of secret routes and safe houses used by 19th century African slaves in the United States to escape to free states and Canada with the aid of abolitionists who were sympathetic to their cause. The term is also applied to the abolitionists who aided the fugitives. Other various routes led to Mexico or overseas. It was created in the early 19th century. The Underground Railroad was at its height between 1850 to 1860. And today, we have the sanctuary movement that assists undocumented workers in their quest to be treated as human beings. So let's watch the past sanctuary movement. Let's watch a film clip from the History Channel on one of the most famous persons to conduct the Underground Railroad, and that is Harriet Tubman. Let's learn something about this woman whom historians identify as the Moses of our people.
Harriet Tubman is considered the Moses of our people, and the kind of courage to escape to slavery yourself, but then to go back for people. And that's the real story of connection.
Here's someone that not only advocated leaving the plantation, but actually developed an underground railroad, a process that would usher people in the still of the night to escape to the north and escape to their freedom.
I mean, it's just imagine you have gotten out of chattel slavery, the institution of slavery. You've escaped, and yet you come back. You have the courage and the care about other people to come back into a hell to try to get other people out of it. It's an amazing story.
No one struck more fear in the hearts of slave owners than Harriet Tubman, because tens of thousands of slave owners had to deal with for the first time the fact that these people are going to rebel. Well, on my slaves part of this movement, they had to look at their servants differently, because here was a woman that far beyond who she could touch, did not know who her followers were. She was far more effective as the symbol that they feared than the few hundred that she saved.
Lots of school children in America don't know a lot about slavery, but they know Harriet Tubman. It's almost a cliche, but it's a cliche that's a necessary one, because it's a story that's not just about black people, but it's about human beings caring for other people and having the courage to do what is right, even at peril to yourself. And so that's what I think her story is about.
Harriet Tubman remains an inspiration, because here's a woman that was, in physical terms, not a mighty woman, had no great education, no great learning, just the sheer determination of a woman to free people and to go up against all odds and risk her life over and over again, and to change the slave's mentality made her an American and a world hero. The irony of it is, when she was once given an award for freeing 500 slaves, she said, "I could have freed more if I could have only convinced them they were slaves." She changed the minds of a lot of American blacks, and she changed American history with the Underground Railroad.
Fantastic. Now, there's 3 amendments to the Constitution that are important for us to remember in this course, because they all address specifically the issue of involuntary immigration. And most importantly, for the first time, define citizenship in the United States. And these amendments are very important because they still address the issue of the undocumented worker. These are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment is the most important to the United States because it's one of the post-Civil War amendments that was first intended to secure rights for former slaves. But most importantly, the 14th Amendment includes the due process and equal protection clauses, amongst others. And the amendment provides a broad definition of United States citizenship that superseded the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford that had excluded slaves imported to Africa and their descendants. The amendment requires states to provide equal protection under the law to all persons within their jurisdiction. And it was used in the mid-20th century to dismantle racial segregation in the United States, as in Brown versus Board of Education. Its due process clause has also been the basis of much important and controversial law regarding privacy rights, especially abortion and other issues. Now, the other two post-Civil War amendments are the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery, and the 15th Amendment, which bans race-based voting qualifications. Now, with the assassination of President Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat, had trouble with Congress because he provided lenient terms for readmission of Southern states that seceded from the Union. And as president, Andrew Johnson appointed governors to Southern states who in turn allowed for the election of Confederates to Congress, and these Confederates ran the state governments in the interest of the planter class. These reconstructed governments immediately initiate apartheid regimes by instituting what became known as the Black Codes, which developed into a system that became identified as Jim Crow. Now, the Black Codes denied African Americans civil rights, and the Black Codes challenged the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The Black Codes recognized marriage and ownership of land for Black people, but it denied them the right to vote. They could not sit on juries, and they could not testify against whites in court. They could be kept out of city and county politics, and they could not leave their place of residence unless they revealed a work permit which allowed them to travel from farm to farm. So in numerous places, Black males especially, were arrested on the slightest pretext. They were sent to prison and then leased out as workers to private corporations. And many private corporations, especially from the North, took advantage of this incarcerated labor force. This became known as the convict lease system. And this new form of slave labor is still with us today. It is still in operation. So let's appreciate the new Jim Crow. Let's take a look at a film clip that helps us understand something about slavery by another name.
Mr. President, I have a brother about 14 years old. A man hired him from me and I heard of him no more. He went and sold him to McRee and they've been working him in prison for 12 months. I asked him to let me have him, but he won't let him go.
For a period of nearly 80 years, between the Civil War and World War II, Black Southerners were no longer slaves, but they were not yet free. In one of the most shameful and little-known chapters of American history, generations of Black Southerners were forced to labor against their will.
From almost the first moment, white Southerners were responding to try to put African Americans back into a position as close to slavery as they possibly could.
The Old South and what was quickly becoming the New South could not proceed without the work of African Americans.
But if you had something for free in the past, you don't necessarily want to pay for it now.
It was a straight, simple, exploitative system. There was only power, there was only force, and there was only brutality.
What happened in that period of time was so much more terrible than anything most Americans recognize or understand today. The depth of poverty, the inability of African Americans to access any of the mechanisms of wealth achievement and growth They're all rooted in this terroristic kind of regime that existed in so many places.
Their ability to have what we call the American dream. That is what has been stolen from black folks all through the South. And that legacy has to be understood so that people will be able to speak to it and give our ancestors voice.
Okay, so as described earlier in the first presentation of this course, the racialization process created a population that was at a disadvantaged position. And the black communities in the United States faced the four-part process of social racial discrimination, of educational deprivation, political disenfranchisement, and economic marginality. So again, acute disillusionment robs life of its meaning, and so a new system of explanation and rationale for action must be created self-consciously. Any community facing prejudice, discrimination, segregation responds in a variety of manners by which to survive the racialization process. There are those who assimilate, there are those who accommodate, and there are those who resist. So we're going to take a look at movements for change within the black community that follow the three different paths. We'll take a look at those who assimilated, those who accommodated, and those who resisted. Because in this way, we can appreciate how communities are diverse in their responses to change. So let's start with assimilation. Let's start with Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee Institute. Now, Booker Taliaferro Washington was an American political leader who was an educator, an orator, and author. He was a dominant figure in the African American community in the United States from 1890 to 1915, and he represented the last generation of black leaders born in slavery. He was speaking for those blacks who had remained in the New South in an exploitative, racist environment with the white Southerners. So Washington was able throughout the final 25 years of his life to maintain his standing as a major black leader because of the sponsorship by powerful whites, substantial support within the black community, and his ability to raise educational funds from both groups. But most importantly, Booker T. Washington was known for his accommodation to the social realities of the age of segregation and the black codes. Washington received national prominence for his Atlanta Address of 1895. It is known as the Atlanta Compromise. It attracted the attention of politicians and the public as a popular spokesperson for African American citizens. Washington built a nationwide network of supporters in many black communities, with black ministers, educators, and businessmen composing his core enthusiasts. Now, his Atlanta Compromise speech was accepted. His Atlanta Compromise speech accepted segregation as long as economic development would be allowed, particularly in agriculture in the black communities. He argued that blacks and whites should be separate. If one resisted the apartheid system, of course, the result would be lynching. So Booker T. Washington very clearly understood that to oppose the black codes would mean death. Yet he understood that white supremacy would at least allow blacks some kind of economic independence. Let's take a look at a film clip that addresses the importance of Booker T. Washington.
Without question, Booker T. Washington was the single most well-known African American of his time and may have been the most celebrated black person in the entire world.
Future educator and orator, Booker T. Washington was born a slave on a Virginia plantation on April 5, 1856.
He had to work as a young child, and so he had to juggle hours walking miles and miles to school and then rush back to work. It was very difficult, but he was determined, and that's how he learned to read and write.
Washington was allowed to attend school while working as a servant, and in 1872 he befriended the founder of Hampton Institute, who offered him a scholarship to the school.
The emphasis at school was on industrial education, on crafts, on technical skills, teaching blacks and the former slaves how to make themselves valuable to the community in a very literal way.
Washington taught at Hampton before being appointed by General Samuel Armstrong to head the newly formed institute in Tuskegee in 1881.
This was a groundbreaking endeavor because Armstrong trusted this young man to go to Alabama and create something basically out of nothing.
During the post-Reconstruction period, tensions between African Americans and Southern whites were at a fever pitch. But as evidence of racial progress, Washington was asked to address a predominantly white audience at the 1895 Atlanta Expo. The speech turned Washington into a national figure.
The Atlanta Compromise speech is viewed as controversial because he essentially said that politics was for mainstream society and the thing for African Americans was to be separate as the fingers on our hand and not involve ourselves with white society.
Booker T. Washington saw that as a bargain that he had to strike. Those who disagreed with him felt that he had conceded far, far too much to the conservative white South.
In 1900, Washington formed the National Negro Business League to promote the economic development of African Americans. 1 year later, he chronicled his life in the autobiography Up From Slavery.
Booker T. Washington's autobiography was one of the most influential books published by an African American at the turn of the century.
Washington urged African Americans to accept their unequal position in society, while secretly funding litigation for civil rights cases. In 1905, however, leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois renounced Washington's philosophy and insisted upon full civil rights for all African Americans.
There were people during Washington's time and even now who were very critical of Washington's racial politics. Washington was willing to trade political and voting rights for economic rights. And Du Bois and others said, that's too hard a bargain.
Washington remained principal of Tuskegee and wrote a total of 14 books before his death on November 14, 1915. He was buried on the campus of Tuskegee University.
Okay, that's Booker T. Washington. Now let's go to another important movement for change in America that was led by W.B. Du Bois. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was an American civil rights activist, Pan-Africanist, sociologist, historian, author, and editor. Historian David Learning Lewis wrote, in the course of his long, turbulent career, W.B. Du Bois attempted virtually every possible solution to the problem of 20th century racism. Scholarship, propaganda, integration, national self-determination, human rights, cultural and economic separatism, politics, international communism, expatriation, third world solidarity. He was the first African-American graduate of Harvard University, where he earned his PhD in history. Du Bois later became a professor of history and economics at Atlanta University. He became the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1910, and he became founder and editor of the NAACP's journal, The Crisis. Du Bois rose to national attention in his opposition to Booker T. Washington's ideas of social integration between whites and blacks. He campaigned instead for increased political representation for blacks in order to guarantee civil rights, and he advocated for the formation of an African-American elite that would work for the progress of the community. Du Bois came to the forefront in opposition to segregation, and he disavowed Booker T. Washington's compromise. He asserted Frederick Douglass's militancy, and he used the law to achieve racial equality. Through the actions of the NAACP, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional Oklahoma's grandfather clause in the state constitution. Oklahoma insisted, when it became a state, that any black person who had grandparents as slaves did not enjoy the right to vote. The NAACP, under the leadership of Du Bois, sought to destroy a caste system based on race to get full class rights. Let's go to a film clip on W.B. Du Bois.
William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, later known as W.E.B. Du Bois, was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, on February 23, 1868. As a young man, Du Bois received a B.A. from Fisk University before becoming the first African American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard in 1895.
What is impressive about W.E.B. Du Bois, when he went to Harvard, they wouldn't accept his 4-year Fisk degree. Du Bois also faced the problem of not being allowed to stay on the Harvard campus after 6 p.m. So if you put it in context historically, it was a great feat.
While teaching at Atlanta University, Du Bois produced a number of academic works, including The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, the first case study of a black community in the United States.
Du Bois went into these blighted areas. He found a population that had terrible health issues, a lot of social ills such as poverty, high infant mortality, prostitution. He didn't entirely excuse the African American population, but in his analysis, he was very forceful about pointing out racism as a reason for a lot of these ills.
Both Du Bois and Booker T. Washington emerged as advocates of their race. However, as an alternative voice to Washington's book, Up From Slavery, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903.
It was an absolutely unique book. It contains poetry, autobiographical sketches, historical articles, memoir, a wide-ranging representation of the diversity of Black experience.
In 1905, Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, opposing Booker T. Washington's racial accommodation theory. The organization became the forerunner of the NAACP, and years later, Du Bois was appointed editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis.
Du Bois wanted The Crisis to have two main components: protest on the one hand and uplift on the other. At the same time that he was protesting lynching and race riots, he was building a consciousness.
While continuing his work for civil rights, Du Bois published his first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, in 1911. 4 years later, he published The Negro, the first general history of Black Africans.
He was one of the early scholars who felt like you could not understand the status and condition of Blacks in the United States unless you came to terms with the status and condition of Africa.
In 1920, Du Bois published the first of his 3 autobiographies, entitled Darkwater: Voices from Within the Veil. Then in 1935, Du Bois published his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America.
With his 3 autobiographies, and in a sense you could say his body of work, Du Bois gave us a document of what it was like to be Black in the American century.
While becoming more influenced by communism, Du Bois made a losing bid for the New York State Senate at the age of 82. By 1961, Du Bois joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana, where he died on August 27, 1963.
W.E.B. Du Bois can be deemed arguably the most profound African American intellectual of his generation. His ideas are still highly relevant for the present generation of scholars.
Okay, so let's understand what it means to be Black in America. Why do we have a movement called Black Lives Matter? All right. Well, let's look at the Great Migration, and perhaps we can find an answer in the historical anxiety that Americans express towards blackness and the involuntary immigrant in general. Now, up to 1920, the Great Migration characterized the Black experience in the U.S. There are migrations from the Civil War on through the 1880s. Blacks do migrate from the South to after the Civil War to northern cities. Some people move to Oklahoma, where they form entire towns, Enid, Oklahoma. A significant few arrive here in Los Angeles, where they moved into abandoned Mexican railroad camps, which today form the communities known as Watts and Compton. But before 1914, the percentage of blacks outside of the South is relatively small. Blacks are not included in the growth of industry since white Europeans workers filled the void. Rather, as Africans, they were limited to service sector jobs such as waiters and domestic servants. So the economic demand for labor in the North does not attract blacks to leave the South after the Civil War. Now, by 1914, the change in the economic capacity to generate jobs in the urban North becomes the primary reason for blacks to migrate from the South. World War I created jobs. The rapid expansion of textiles for uniforms, the growth of the steel industry for airplanes and ammunition, and the war industry needed workers. Well, why black workers? Well, first, white males are being recruited to fight the war. 4 million were forced to enlist. Furthermore, the industrial labor force, which was predominantly European at the time, was stymied. When World War I broke out in Europe, Europeans stopped coming to America. And since the labor supply to increase production is a constant in capitalism, especially during war, there was a need for infusion of labor forces from the South. Advertisements proliferated in the South, recruiting black males specifically for wartime jobs. And this recruitment led to the historical experience known as the Great Migration. Now, America has a need to create social control when they perceive racial imbalance. Let's understand this process clearly. Let's go take a look at this map here. Let's bring this map up and let's understand this Great Migration. Now, when black people start moving up into the north and over to the west, and when they do not look like the same people that are of the community. So you think about, again, let's understand the need for social control when there is racial imbalance. Let's understand this process clearly. When too many people who do not look like you take over your community, you react, right? I mean, there's a new people coming in. They don't look like you, they don't talk like you, and they definitely cook food different than you. So as an American, you demand that they conform to your standards or else, right? Now, this is the nativist expression. So you want to implement methods of social control to make sure that the incoming population recognizes boundaries of acceptance. So you see, methods of social control can be applied to any group in any society. Now, one of the reasons why the Ku Klux Klan is going to gain national recognition in 1915, meaning that they had organized chapters in every state of the Union by then, that they move into the North, was that they were organized to make sure that nativism guaranteed white supremacy. The nativism, the nativist character, was spurred on by the KKK to guarantee white privilege. So let's talk about lynching. Why do Southern whites like to make it a holiday occasion to see a black man hanging from a tree? Why do they come out en masse to see a Negro lynched? Now, in the South after 1865, lynchings became dramatic. In 1889, the Negro Yearbook, kept by the Tuskegee Institute, kept track of lynchings. They recorded 3,700 that year. The peak came in the 1890s when the lynching was recorded every day in a southern state. Lynchings were directed towards the entrepreneurial leadership in the black community. That's why Booker T. Washington came out with the Atlanta Compromise. The Southern white politician liked Booker T. Washington because he didn't protest the hanging of a black man. Economic competition is a major source of violence directed towards the unwanted elements in the community. So students, please remember these images of black, tarred, and feathered when we journey down the road towards appreciating the undocumented worker today. Let's go to a documentary on lynching.
James Allen has collected a photographic record of racial violence in the South. For the past 20 years, he's found horrifying pictures in the family albums of ordinary Southern homes. Many are postcards that were mass-produced as souvenirs.
Some of these images were printed in the tens of thousands and sold for a dime or $1 a piece. Some of the postcards tell you where to write and the discounts you'll get if you buy 1, 10, or 100. They were sold in drugstores and pharmacies. They were sold on the street. I purchased a photograph from a woman. The photographer sold them door to door. Her mother bought the image for $2. A murder that is of particular interest to me was of a 17-year-old boy by the name of Jess Washington in Waco, Texas, in 1916. He was seriously mentally challenged. The wife of the farmer that he worked for was found dead. He was arrested. He was brought to trial. Trial took from 10 until 12. And when the jury came back at noon and found him guilty, someone in the courtroom, and it would have been anyone in the courtroom, screamed out, "Get that nigger." Then one of the worst and cruelest treatments of a human being began. Jess was kicked down out of the courthouse, down the back steps where a crowd of several hundred was waiting for him. They put a chain on his neck. There were 16,000 people crowding the street to watch this boy be tortured. Jess was tied to the chain over a branch of a tree. The fire was started. They raised Jess from the fire up into the air so that the crowd could see him. There were cheers, like at a football game, cheering the torturers on. When Jess tried to climb up the chain, hand by hand, they cut his fingers off one by one, so that all he could do was slap at the chain. They lowered him back down in the fire. A man came up and castrated him. Another man kept a pole so that he couldn't crawl out of the fire. And time and again they pulled him up to keep him from dying so that the crowd could be satisfied. Until he finally died.
Laws passed in the states to end this practice could not be enforced. That's why W. Du Bois and the NAACP increased their attempts to pass federal legislation to outlaw lynching. And there's a long history of violence in the South. Arizona today is just reflecting this heritage. It is a racist expression of a cultural legacy. Let's talk about the psychological internalization of this racist legacy. This internalization is reinforced through methods of racial segregation. The black codes, or more familiarly Jim Crow laws, reinforced economic dependency and a caste system regardless of class status. See, your class is economic while your race determines your caste status. This is continuous until the 1960s rebellion against apartheid, and it begins in the 1950s bus boycotts. But this is social control. It exists in the North, but not to such an extreme degree as in the South. So when the Great Migration did occur, northern white communities responded. Race riots began initiated by white communities against blacks entering their neighborhoods. East St. Louis is the classic example, but there's other examples like Tulsa, Oklahoma. But East St. Louis erupts in 1917, and 39 blacks and 29 whites are going to die in violence as whites went into black neighborhoods and killed at random. And this is the first time in history where blacks fought back. These riots occurred numerous times in the North. Now, the difference in this violence than in the South was that it was random, committed by spontaneous gangs of whites. It was not a systematic hunting of white leaders as in the South. And as Malcolm X would state, stop talking about the South. As long as you are south of Canada, you are in the South. White people do not like it when black people move into their neighborhoods. This is the difference between abolition and anti-slavery. As long as the Negroes don't move into our neighborhoods, I'll be fine. Let's take a look at a documentary film capturing the 1917 East St. Louis uprising.
East St. Louis back then was an industrial boom town with all kinds of conflicts and tensions between ethnic and political groups, between workers, companies, unions, but there were plenty of jobs. When World War I cut off the flow of immigrants from Eastern Europe, companies went to the American South for a fresh supply of cheap, unskilled labor. And now these northern industrial cities had a new issue to deal with, something they called the Negro problem. Like the Eastern Europeans before them, African Americans now left home to find work and to start new lives in northern industrial cities. and they heard that if you couldn't get a job in East St. Louis, you couldn't get a job anywhere. There had always been African Americans living in the American Bottoms, but their numbers were relatively small until now. You could see it every day at the East St. Louis train station, the new arrivals from the South coming in such numbers that they were becoming more visible in town, in the factories, and in politics. These were loyal Lincoln Republicans anxious to vote, and Republican Party leaders were anxious to get them registered.
It upsets the political balance in the first couple of decades, especially in that second decade. And there's lots of talk, especially in the teens, about voter fraud.
The charges came from the Democrats, and during Woodrow Wilson's 1916 re-election campaign, the Justice Department investigated what was being called colonization, an alleged conspiracy to import blacks to steal elections in northern cities. One story, unsupported by evidence but widely circulated, was a plot to have blacks vote in East St. Louis, then board a train to vote in Springfield, and a third time in Chicago.
If you take the newspapers at face value, you would say the public perception was, oh yes, there was colonization. But when you start digging through the testimonies, people knew it wasn't that at all. Black folks were trickling into the city. World War I opened the floodgates. They were coming anyway for jobs, and the contemporaries knew that.
But people were being told they were here to steal elections. Labor leaders said they were here to steal jobs. And the huge numbers of newcomers were straining the local housing and services. Racial tensions continued to grow. It's not that the country was ever really at peace with itself in this era. There were race riots and labor battles like these in other cities before and after. But what happened in East St. Louis struck a national nerve. The reports of Americans killing Americans came on the same front pages as the reports of American troops in Europe fighting to save democracy. It was labor troubles at the aluminum ore plant that set the tragic events in motion. The company followed its usual practice of bringing in replacement workers to break the strikes and keep the plant in operation. But now many of the replacements were Negroes. There were white replacements too, but strike leaders made blacks the issue and the target.
It becomes so conflated with racial animosity too. It's the way that you can organize people and organize a mob. That's what they did.
In the spring of 1917, the National Guard was brought in to protect the factory and its workers. But everybody knew this was a town on the verge of a race riot. When violence flared up in May, the Guard was able to keep it under control. But East St. Louis hadn't cooled off. Tensions built, fueled by unsubstantiated press reports of Negro crime waves and gun purchases, and by rumors and inflammatory public speeches.
They wanted to drive the blacks out of East St. Louis. They wanted to make East St. Louis an all-white town.
The evening of Sunday, July 1st, a car drove through a Negro neighborhood firing shots as it drove by. Later, when another car approached, shots were fired from the crowd. Maybe some thought it was the same car, but it wasn't. Police officers were in this one, and 2 were killed. When word of what happened spread, white mobs set out to attack blacks. They beat, shot, lynched, even burned to death. Fires were set in black neighborhoods and people were shot as they tried to escape the flames. A family just up from Mississippi stepped right into the middle of it.
And just as we got to 10th Street, where we were standing, we could see different people running and hollering, colored people. And they were getting down in the weeds that they were hiding from. And the guy would run and shoot you. He didn't know what to shoot. You just see the smoke and hear the shot.
That was a scary time.
The daughter of former Mayor Melbourne Stevens was told to stay indoors, and she watched from her bedroom window.
You could hear cars racing by and people yelling and screaming. And I could see all the fires burning. Where they'd set fire, to the colored houses. I was petrified.
No one will ever know for sure how many people were killed in the East St. Louis race riot of 1917. Some of the early reports were exaggerated. The official death toll was 39 blacks and 9 whites. Others accepted the higher number of 100, almost all black. They searched for bodies, but so many people couldn't be accounted for. Maybe they had crossed the bridge to St. Louis. Maybe their bodies were somewhere in the river. The nation responded with speeches, editorials, and accusations. Some blamed labor, the police, city government, industry for importing blacks. Some said whites had only acted to prevent a black uprising. In the South, many said the race riot exposed Northern hypocrisy and showed what was really awaiting Southern blacks in northern cities.
By the 19-teens, it was the North's turn to decide on the Negro question. And I see East St. Louis as a harbinger of white supremacy, Northern style.
Despite pressures from blacks and whites to condemn the riot, President Wilson made no statement. But Congress investigated the riot, the crimes, and the city of East St. Louis itself. This wasn't a black eye. This was a self-inflicted wound that would leave an ugly scar, if it ever healed at all.
Okay, so these experiences of the Great Migration with economic dependency, the psychological internalization of racism, the violence that was inflicted on the community from hate mongers, influenced different types of responses to social control. We had Booker T. Washington, the Tuskegee Institute, followed a path of peaceful acceptance and accommodation to the racialist order. W.B. Du Bois and the NAACP fought for civil rights reform and integration. Now let's understand a key element in the black community that emphasizes nationalism and resistance. Let's appreciate Marcus Garvey and the United Negro Improvement Association. Now, Marcus Garvey is going to initiate the first mass movement of African Americans, which will develop in the North. Garvey will not challenge the legal system, but he will hold out a vision of a black nation by asserting Pan-Africanism. Marcus Garvey sought black pride and economic independence through black enterprise and organizations. And when he arrived in Harlem in 1916, he challenged African Americans by exclaiming, "Wake up, you mighty race." He was a Jamaican by birth. Marcus Garvey's leadership and vision of a better life for African Americans rallied many against racial injustice. Let's watch a film clip on the importance of this man to the African American heritage.
Marcus Garvey wanted to return African Americans to Africa, to create a vibrant black nation, empowered through economic independence. Although some of his goals were controversial, his crusade would inspire leaders from Malcolm X to Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela.
Garvey was certainly a controversial figure, but the concepts that we now think of as black nationalism and black pride started with Garvey's pronouncements.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey was born in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica, on August 17, 1887. Beginning as a printer's apprentice at 14, Garvey became a union organizer and later worked various jobs across Central America.
Marcus Garvey found wherever he went, black people of the African heritage in particular were always on the lower stratification end of society. This had a profound impact on him. Particularly, his concern was for the uplift of African people globally.
In 1912, Garvey sailed to London, England, and took night courses at Birkbeck College. After working for a Pan-African newspaper, Garvey returned to Jamaica in 1914 and formed the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA.
The UNIA was about Black self-determination. It was about galvanizing the ideas of Black repatriation to the motherland, the continent of Africa. And it was extremely important in terms of getting Black people to understand self-pride, pride in one's race.
Inspired by Booker T. Washington to raise funds and start his own school, Garvey came to the United States in 1916 and in 1918 began publishing the Negro World newspaper.
Garvey was extremely outspoken. He was, some people would say, almost bombastic. He wanted to take over Africa and had elected himself as president of Africa without consulting the Africans, unfortunately.
Determined to achieve economic independence for African Americans, Garvey launched the Negroes Factories Association in 1919 and a shipping company called the Black Star Line, which he planned to use to transport passengers back to Africa.
Garvey was a great organizer, but unfortunately not a great businessman. During the time that Garvey and the UNIA were trying to launch the Black Star Line, they solicited funds from investors for stock options through the mail. And this resulted later on in allegations of mail fraud, and Garvey was convicted and sent to prison.
After serving 5 years in prison, Garvey was deported. He eventually moved to London, and in 1938, he supported the Greater Liberia Act, created by known white supremacist Senator Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi.
Marcus Garvey's association with Senator Bilbo is related more on a practical level rather than an intellectual like for each other. Marcus Garvey's attempt to help Africans in America leave and go to Africa fell in line with some aspects of KKK philosophy.
Garvey died in London on June 10, 1940. He was reinterred in Jamaica in 1964 and is hailed as Jamaica's first national hero and the prophet of the Rastafarian religion.
Although Garvey was a flawed leader, he's someone who is really important to the history of the Black radical tradition. He was probably one of the strongest voices of Black nationalism in history.
Okay, so these are methods of how involuntary immigrants sought autonomy, in numerous ways rejecting means of social, economic, and political control. Again, what we have learned from the immigrant experience is that when you are in a disadvantaged position, you must organize for your rights. And in this particular case, it was black against white. Now, just imagine that you are not wanted as part of this American dream. This means that you have to improvise your existence to the reality. You must act out your dream of being accepted as an American citizen. Now, despite the obstacles, you must search from within and find a new system of explanation. You must find a rationale for action. And this has to be created self-consciously. So at one time, a highly recognizable individual established himself as a brilliant soloist and became a major musical innovator famous for his virtuosity and rhythmic dynamism. Louis Armstrong exhibited pure tone, dazzling speed, and imaginative variations that in many ways remain unequaled. Louis Armstrong, this was a black man improvising his existence in white America. We must honor him for introducing us to improvisation, a way to exist beyond ourselves in our confined boundaries of color. Let's appreciate the man, the ambassador of jazz, the music America was waiting for in the racialized, anti-immigrant times of the era.
Although he always believed that his birthday was July 4th, 1900, Louis Armstrong was actually born on August 4th, 1901, in a section of New Orleans so violent It was called the battlefield. His father, a day laborer named William Armstrong, had left the family, and his children rarely saw him. His mother, Mayanne, was only 16 when he was born, and she sometimes worked as a prostitute to support herself and her children.
Louis Armstrong talks about how sometimes he didn't know what he was going to eat, and that sometimes they were on a level of poverty where he didn't know what was going to come next. He was used to his stomach growling. Knife fights, gun fights, razor fights. This is the environment that Louis Armstrong grew up in. He saw a certain side of life, but he saw everything in that side of life. He didn't see the cliche like what we would write about. He didn't see that side of life from the standpoint of an outsider who's, oh, this is such a terrible thing. He saw the whole thing of it. He saw the humor in it, the beauty in it, the ugliness of it. He saw it all, and he understood it all.
At the age of 7, he went to work for the Karnofskys, a Russian Jewish immigrant family who delivered coal to the prostitutes of Storyville. Louis rode in their wagon and blew a long tin horn to let the Karnofskys' clients know they were coming.
You have to think about a little kid that realizes something is wrong. And they don't know what it is, but soon they realize that what's wrong is the color of their skin. Being called nigger, seeing grown men called boy and addressed in a disrespectful fashion. And then into this environment comes somebody who's like the people that you have seen degrade all the other people you know, but all of a sudden they're nice to you. And they invite you into their home. They try to look out for you, they give you had something to eat. It's then with the Karnofskys as a boy, he understands, well, we're all human beings.
Mrs. Karnofsky insisted he eat a good dinner every evening before going home, and Armstrong never forgot the family's kindness to him. All his life, he would wear a Star of David and cherish Mrs. Karnofsky's lullabies. One day, Louis spotted a battered cornet in a pawn shop window and asked the Karnofskys to advance him the $5 to buy it. After blowing into it a little while, Armstrong remembered, I realized I could play Home Sweet Home. Then, here come the blues.
The first time he touched the trumpet, he sounded great. I'm sure of that. He just was one of those people who had the spirit was in him. And that understanding that comes from the creator of humanity, he had that.
He knew he was good, you know. He did know that. He said, what I have is God-given. That's what he said. And he'd always say, can you imagine me and Gabriel up there? I'm going to blow him out of the clouds. He'd say that all the time, too.
It's a general rule that children look for heroes. They look for people to emulate. And in that community at that time, you were going to either emulate the guy with the pistol who, whipped his whores in the bar in front of everybody to show what a man he was, or the musicians, because the musicians were very highly respected. They were an essential part of the community. Every family function, from a birth to a Sunday picnic to a funeral, was a musical event. Musicians were important. They dressed well. They were treated well.
At age 11, Armstrong dropped out of school for good, formed a vocal quartet that sang and danced on the street corners of Black Storyville, and listened to the new jazz music that was everywhere around him. But Armstrong also got into trouble. I remember running around with a lot of bad boys which did a lot of crazy things, he said. And in 1913, he was arrested for firing his stepfather's pistol on New Year's Eve.
January 2nd, 1913.
6 white boys were arrested in Canal Street for disturbing the peace. The most serious case last night was that of Louis Armstrong, an 11-year-old Negro who discharged a revolver at Rampart and Perdido Streets. Being an old offender, he was sent to the Colored Waifs Home. New Orleans Times-Picayune.
Within a few months of his arrival at the Colored Waifs Home, Armstrong was the best cornet player in its marching band, even though its manager was convinced that no boy from the battlefield would ever amount to anything. Soon, he was the leader. When Armstrong led the band through his old neighborhood for the first time, all the whores, gamblers, thieves, and beggars were waiting for the band because they knew that May Ann's son would be in it. They ran to wake up Mama so she could see me go by, he remembered. They never dreamed that I would be playing the cornet, blowing it as good as I could.
He was marching along with the band, so we got real close to him to see if he was actually playing those notes. We didn't believe he could learn to play in that short time. I can still remember he was playing Maryland, My Maryland. And he sure was swinging out that melody. Zooty Singleton.
The onlookers were so proud to see that little Louis, someone from their neighborhood, had done so well that they dropped enough coins in the boys' hats to pay for brand new instruments and uniforms for the whole band.
Okay, so that's the black experience. So let's appreciate the immigration restriction legislation of the 1920s once again through the National Origins Act of 1924. As Europeans, as we learned from last week, the white beans, as they were agitating for an 8-hour day and the rights for women, the rights for immigrants, and rights for children, blacks, the involuntary immigrants, increasingly faced prejudice, discrimination, and segregation. The Ku Klux Klan became a national organization by 1915, and by the 1920s boasted 4.5 million members. Congress in the 20s responded to the fear of the other, to the fear of the not me, to the fear of the stranger at the gate, by putting an end to the dangerous, turbulent flood of immigrants by passing laws setting immigration quotas. The quotas favored Anglo-Saxons, it kept out Africans and Asians, and it limited severely the coming of Southern and Eastern Europeans, Slavic peoples, Italians, and Jews. There was mob violence everywhere, and there was hatred, race hatred everywhere. Yet everyone loved the new musical influence known as jazz. It was improvisation, especially if one was black. Of course, the hatred was extended to everyone, and if you were from Asia, confusion created chaos, and it added new dimensions between black and white. Okay, so we've taken care of the red beans, the white beans, and the black beans. Next up, the yellow beans. See you.